Hello, my dear adventurers. If you like the story, please subscribe. Welcome back to another evening of shared tales and journeys through time. Tonight, we travel far beyond the green hills and quiet villages of the world you know. We journey to Middle-earth, to a time before time, when the world was young and the stars were new. We shall speak of power and pride, of great works and terrible falls, and of one who was once beautiful and wise, who became the shadow that would haunt the world for ages beyond counting. This is a tale of Sauron, the Dark Lord, though that is not how his story begins. No, his beginning was bright and full of promise, for even the darkest shadows must first have light to fall from. So settle in, wrap yourself warm, and let us journey back to the very dawn of creation, to understand how a servant of beauty became the master of ruin. I do love these deep dives into the lore of Middle-earth, exploring the great tapestry that Tolkien wove. If you enjoy these longer journeys through myth and legend, and you want to support more stories like this, consider checking out my Patreon linked down below. But for now, pour yourself something warm, perhaps tea with honey or spice cider. Find a comfortable spot and let us begin at the very beginning. In the beginning there was Eru, the One, who in the Elvish tongue is called Ilúvatar, which means Father of all. Eru dwelt alone in the timeless halls, in the void beyond the world, and his thoughts were vast beyond measure. From these thoughts, from the depths of his boundless mind, he brought forth the Ainur, the Holy Ones, beings of pure spirit born from his own being. Each of the Ainur was given a portion of Eru's own nature, a fragment of his thoughts made manifest, and each was unique in their gifts and understanding. Among the Ainur were the greatest, those of immense power, who would later be called the Valar, which means the powers of the world. These were beings like Manwë, who understood the winds and the airs, Ulmo, who knew the depths of all waters, Aulë the smith, who loved the substances of earth, stone and metal and crystal. There was Yavanna, who thought of all things that grow, and many others, each mighty and glorious in their own right. But the Ainur were not only the Valar. There were also the Maiar, the people of the Valar, lesser in power perhaps, but no less beautiful in their nature. These were countless in number, spirits of grace and strength, each drawn to serve and learn from the greater Ainur, whose thoughts most closely matched their own. And among these Maiar, in those days before the world began, there was one named Mairon. Mairon, his name meant the admirable, or the excellent one, and in those early days he lived up to his name. He was a Maia of Aulë, the smith, drawn to that great Valar's love of crafting and making, of bringing order to substance and creating things of beauty and purpose. Mairon loved precision and structure. He delighted in understanding how things worked, in the eternal laws that governed shape and form, in the perfect geometries that underlay creation. Imagine him then, in those timeless days, a being of brilliant light and keen intelligence, working alongside Aulë in the great halls beyond the world. He would have helped shape the concepts of metals and stones, the principles by which mountains would rise and valleys sink, the patterns by which crystals would form deep in the earth. He was drawn to order, to the satisfaction of seeing chaos transformed into purpose and structure. Then came the great music, the Ainulindalë, which means the music of the Ainur. Eru presented themes to the Ainur, patterns of thought and sound, and bid them make a great music to show forth their understanding. The Aina sang together, and their voices blended in harmonies beyond mortal comprehension, creating beauty upon beauty, weaving melodies that expressed all the wonder and glory that could be. But among the Ainur was one who would prove different from all others. Melkor was his name, and he was the mightiest of all the Ainur, given portions of the power of all others, intended by Eru to be the greatest of his children. Yet Melkor had begun to have thoughts of his own, thoughts that came not from Eru, but from the emptiness, from the void. He desired to create things of his own, to have servants and followers who would call him master, to fill the void with his own designs rather than participate in Eru's grand vision. So when the great music began, Melkor wove into it themes of his own devising, thoughts that clashed with what Eru had presented. At first these were subtle, but they grew stronger, and soon there was discord in the music. Some of the Ainur near Melkor faltered in their singing, and some began to attune their music to his rather than to Eru's themes, seduced by the power and grandeur of Melkor's voice. Mairon heard that discord. He heard the strength in Melkor's themes, the compelling force of will that demanded attention. And while Aulë remained true to Eru's music, something in Mairon stirred with interest. The discord spoke to something deep within him, something he had not known was there, a desire not just for order, but for the power to impose that order, to make all things conform to a perfect pattern of his own understanding. 3 times Eru introduced new themes, and 3 times Melkor challenged them with discord, and each time the music grew more complex and more troubled. Yet from this very struggle came deeper beauty, for Eru showed that even Melkor's rebellion would, in the end, serve to make the music greater, bringing forth depths of feeling and majesty that could not have existed without the shadow of conflict. When the music ended, Eru showed the Ainur a vision, a great unfolding of what their music had wrought. They saw a world Ada, the earth spinning in the void, and upon it they saw oceans and lands, mountains and forests, and most wonderfully, they saw the children of Ilúvatar who would dwell there. The elves would come first, the firstborn, immortal and beautiful, bound to the world until its ending, and after them would come men, the second children, mortal and brief, with a strange freedom and a fate beyond the circles of the world. Many of the Ainur were content to remain in the timeless halls, to dwell in the presence of Eru and contemplate what they had helped create. But others yearned to enter into that vision, to make it real, to participate directly in the shaping of the world they had helped to sing into being. Chief among these was Melkor, who desired the world for himself, and with him came many others, some in loyalty to Eru, others in secret allegiance to Melkor's growing pride. Aulë the smith was among those who wished to enter the world, for he loved the thought of shaping mountains and carving valleys, of filling the earth with substances of wonder and utility. And with Aulë came many of his Maia, including Mairon. They descended into the vision, and the vision became reality, and they found themselves within the circles of the world, bound now to its fate, for better or for worse. In those early ages, the Ainur who had entered the world labored to give it shape and form. They raised the pillars of the sky and carved the basins of the great seas. They kindled lights and set the courses of stars. It was a time of great works, and Mairon delighted in it. Working beside Aulë, he helped establish the bones of the earth, the deep structures upon which all else would rest. But Melkor was already at work sowing discord and destruction. Where the others built, he tore down. Where they brought order, he created confusion. He desired to have the world for himself, to rule it absolutely, and he could not bear that others should create things of beauty and permanence. The first great conflict had begun, the war between Melkor and the other Valar for the shape and fate of the world. Melkor was strong, stronger than any single one of the Valar, and he had servants of his own, Maia, who had been corrupted by his discord during the music, or who had been seduced by his power after entering the world. These formed his following, and chief among them would eventually be one who had not yet fallen, but who watched and listened and wondered at the strength Melkor displayed. The Valar established themselves in Almaren, in the midst of the great lake in the center of Middle-earth, and there they made their dwelling. They set two great lamps, Illuin in the north and Ormul in the south, to light the world in those days before the sun and moon. Under that gentle light, the first growing things began to appear, and the world grew beautiful. Mairon saw this beauty, and part of him rejoiced in it, for it was order and structure given living form. Yet he also saw how it was imperfect, how things grew wild and chaotic, how there was waste and randomness, and he began to think that perhaps a stronger hand was needed, that beauty and order should not be left to chance in nature, but should be guided, controlled, perfected. These were dangerous thoughts, the first stirrings of the pride that would be his undoing, though he did not recognize them as such. He thought himself still loyal, still good, merely more aware than others of how much better things could be with proper guidance and control. Then came the disaster. Melkor, working in secret in the far north, had built himself a mighty fortress, Utumno, delving deep into the earth and raising mountains above to hide his works. From there, he struck at the Valar, overthrowing the great lamps. They fell and broke, and the lands were shaped and twisted in the cataclysm, and the spring of Arda, that first beautiful age, came to a terrible end. The Valar withdrew from Middle-earth, going to the far west to the land of Aman, where they raised the mountains of the Pelori as a fence against Melkor, and created their new realm of Valinor, the blessed land. There they made new lights, the two trees, Telperion the silver, and Laurelin the golden, and under their mingled radiance, Valinor became a place of surpassing beauty. But Middle-earth they left largely in darkness, and Melkor became its master, spreading his shadow far and wide. The Maia who served the Valar dwelt with them in Valinor, including Mairon, and for a time he was content. He worked with Aulë, crafting wonders, studying the nature of materials and forces, growing ever more skilled and knowledgeable. Yet he did not forget what he had seen of Melkor's power, and sometimes, in his innermost thoughts, he wondered if the Valar had been right to withdraw, to leave Middle-earth to darkness and corruption. Would it not have been better to impose order, to force Melkor to submit, to make the world conform to a perfect pattern regardless of the cost? These thoughts remained private, hidden even from himself in many ways, buried under layers of loyalty and duty. But they were there, seeds waiting for the right conditions to grow. And those conditions would come in time, when the world changed once more, and new opportunities for power and dominion presented themselves. For now, though, Mairon remained among the people of the Valar, admirable and excellent, a bright spirit devoted to his craft, with no outward sign of the darkness that would one day consume him. The ages passed in Valinor, timeless and peaceful, while in Middle-earth the shadows deepened and Melkor worked his will unopposed, shaping terrible servants and preparing for wars yet to come. And in the timeless halls, Eru watched it all, seeing the patterns unfold, the music playing out in all its complexity, the discord and harmony weaving together toward ends only he could fully perceive. The story of the world was only beginning, and the part that Mairon would play in it was still unwritten, still a matter of choices not yet made, paths not yet taken. But the seeds were planted in the music and in the heart of one bright spirit who loved order perhaps too well. And from such small beginnings would grow consequences beyond imagining, a shadow that would stretch across ages until the very end of the world as it was first made. The years of the trees passed in Valinor, long and peaceful, while Middle-earth lay under shadow. The elves had awakened by the shores of Cuiviénen, the water of awakening, under the stars that Vardar had kindled in the heavens. They were the firstborn, as beautiful and strange as the Valar had seen in their vision, and when news of their coming reached Valinor, the Valar knew that they must act. Melkor had already found the elves and had begun working his evil among them, stealing some away into his dungeons, twisting and breaking them in body and spirit. So the Valar went to war against Melkor. It was a terrible conflict that reshaped the north of Middle-earth, shattering mountains and draining seas. Utumno was besieged and broken, its halls torn open to the sky, and Melkor himself was taken captive, bound with a chain that had been forged especially for him, called Angainor. He was brought to Valinor in defeat and sentenced to imprisonment in the halls of Mandos for 3 ages. During this war, Mairon remained in Valinor. He had no part in the battle, for his role was that of a craftsman, not a warrior. He heard tales of the fighting from those who returned, stories of Melkor's vast fortress, of the terrible weapons and creatures he had made, of the corruption and ruin he had spread across Middle-earth. And Mairon listened, with a complex mixture of horror and fascination, for Melkor had done what the Valar had not. He had imposed his will absolutely on a portion of the world. Twisted and evil though his works were, they demonstrated a kind of power that Mairon found compelling. The Valar worked with the world, respecting its nature, allowing growth and change and even chaos. Melkor had sought to dominate it completely, to remake it in his own image. The elves were brought to Valinor, or at least many of them were. Some remained in Middle-earth, either by choice or because they never completed the great journey. Those who came to the blessed land dwelt in the light of the two trees and grew in skill and knowledge, learning from the Valar and the Maia. It was a golden age, and Mairon taught some of the elves himself, sharing his knowledge of crafting and making. He was good at teaching, patient and thorough, and the elves who studied with him praised his clarity and wisdom. He seemed everything that a Maia should be, helpful, knowledgeable, devoted to beauty and order. Yet within him, something had begun to change, so gradually that he hardly noticed it himself. He began to feel frustrated by the limitations placed on him. Aulë was his master, and while Aulë was generous with knowledge, there were secrets he kept, depths of understanding that he did not share with his Maia. Mairon began to feel that he could go further, achieve more, if only he were not constrained by another's authority. He looked at the elves and saw how they struggled with their crafts, how they made mistakes and created imperfect works. How much better it would be, he thought, if they simply followed his designs exactly, without deviation or personal interpretation. The results would be far superior, more perfect, more orderly. These thoughts grew stronger over time, fed by his pride in his own abilities and his increasing impatience with what he saw as inefficiency and waste. He began to imagine how he might organize things better, how he might create a perfect order if given the authority to do so. 3 ages passed and Melkor's sentence came to an end. He was released from the halls of Mando, seemingly repentant, claiming to have learned from his punishment and to desire now only to help repair the damage he had caused. The Valar, in their mercy, allowed him to dwell in Valinor, though he was not permitted to leave the land or to have his own dwelling. He went about among the elves and the Maia, offering counsel and aid, and outwardly he seemed reformed, but it was all deception. Melkor had learned nothing except greater cunning. His pride and his desire for domination were as strong as ever, merely hidden now beneath a mask of humility and service. And he began, slowly and carefully, to work corruption among those who dwelt in Valinor. He spoke to the elves, particularly the Noldor, who were the most skilled in crafts and most eager for knowledge. He fed their pride and their desire for independence, suggesting that the Valar were keeping them like children, preventing them from achieving their full potential. He hinted at wonders beyond Valinor that they were being denied, at opportunities they were losing by remaining in the blessed land. And he spoke also to certain of the Maia, those in whom he sensed dissatisfaction or ambition. He was subtle, never openly advocating rebellion, but rather asking questions, raising doubts, suggesting possibilities. He sought out those who felt constrained or overlooked. those who believed they could do better if given the chance. It was during this time that Melkor approached Mairon. The Dark Valar had been watching the brilliant Maia of Aulë, noting his skills and sensing the discontent that Mairon himself barely acknowledged. Melkor began with simple conversations about the nature of craft and order, discussions that seemed innocent enough. "You have remarkable gifts," Melkor said to him one day as they walked in the gardens of Valinor. "I have watched you teach the elves, and your knowledge surpasses that of many who are counted among the great. Tell me, does it not frustrate you to see lesser minds struggle with concepts you find simple?" Mairon was flattered and disarmed by the attention. "It can be trying," he admitted, "but patience is a virtue, or so I am told. They will learn in time." "Ah, but how much time?" Melkor pressed gently. "And how much is lost in that learning? How many imperfect works are created? How much material wasted? How much potential unrealized? If they would simply trust those wiser than themselves, if they would follow perfect patterns rather than insisting on their own flawed innovations, how much more could be achieved?" This struck a chord in Mairon, for he had thought similar things himself. "There is truth in what you say," he replied slowly. "Order and efficiency are lost when each individual pursues their own vision without regard for superior knowledge." "Exactly so," Melkor said, his voice warm with approval. "You understand. So few do, you know. The Valar preach freedom and growth, but they do not consider the cost of chaos and imperfection. They are content to let things develop naturally, even when that means waste and suffering." Over many such conversations, Melkor slowly and carefully worked his poison into Mairon's thoughts. He never directly criticized the Valar or suggested rebellion. Instead, he simply reinforced Mairon's own doubts and desires, validating feelings that the Maia had been taught to suppress or ignore. He spoke of the great works that could be accomplished with proper order and control, of the beauty that could be achieved, if only there were the will to impose perfection rather than wait for it to emerge naturally. He painted a vision of a world remade along perfect lines, every part functioning in harmony, all chaos eliminated, everything in its proper place. Of course, Melkor would say, such a vision requires strength to implement. The weak-willed will always resist, preferring comfortable chaos to disciplined order. Only those with true understanding and the courage to act on it can hope to achieve such heights. Mairon began to see himself, as Melkor suggested, as one of the few who truly understood, who had the vision and knowledge to create perfection, if only he had the power and authority to do so. His dissatisfaction with his position grew. Why should he remain merely a servant of Aulë when his own understanding had grown so great? Why should he defer to others when he could see so clearly what needed to be done? The mask came off when Melkor stole the Silmarils, the 3 great jewels that Fëanor had made, which captured the light of the 2 trees. With the help of Ungoliant, a creature of shadow and hunger, Melkor destroyed the trees themselves, plunging Valinor into darkness. He fled back to Middle-earth, and the peace of Valinor was shattered. In the darkness and confusion that followed, Mairon faced a choice. The The Valar would pursue Melkor, would seek to contain and punish him. The proper course, the loyal course, would be to stand with the Valar, to aid them in opposing the dark enemy. But Melkor had offered him something else, a place at his side, a role in remaking the world according to their shared vision of order and perfection. Mairon told himself that he was not choosing evil. He was choosing effectiveness over sentiment, order over chaos, the courage to act over passive acceptance. He told himself that Melkor's methods might be harsh, but they were necessary, that the end of perfect order justified the means of control and domination. So, when Melkor fled to Middle-earth, Mairon went with him, abandoning Valinor and the service of the Valar. He left in secret, not in the exodus of the Noldor who pursued Melkor seeking vengeance for the Silmarils, but separately, slipping away in the darkness and the confusion. By the time he reached Middle-earth, Melkor had established himself in Angband, a new fortress he built in the north, delving deep into the earth and raising mountains of slag and stone above it. The gates of Angband opened onto the plain of Anfaglith, which would become a desert of choking dust. Here in the pits and forges of Angband, Melkor gathered his strength and prepared for war against the elves. Mairon came to Angband and presented himself to Melkor, now called Morgoth, the dark enemy, by the elves. And Morgoth welcomed him with great pleasure, for here was one of the Maia of Aulë, a craftsman of surpassing skill, now willing to place that skill in service of Morgoth's will. "Welcome, Mairon," Morgoth said. "Or perhaps we should find you a new name, for you have left behind your old life and your old allegiances. You are now my most valued servant, my lieutenant, the executor of my will. What shall we call you?" And so Mairon took a new name, or perhaps had it given to him. Sauron, which in the Elvish tongue means the abhorred, though at the time he did not see the irony in this. He thought himself still admirable, still pursuing worthy ends through necessary means. He did not yet understand that he had chosen a path from which there would be no easy return. Sauron proved invaluable to Morgoth. Where Morgoth was a creature of destruction and chaos despite his talk of order, Sauron truly did have a gift for organization and efficiency. He became the administrator of Angband, overseeing the forges where weapons and armor were made, organizing the breeding pits where Morgoth twisted elves into orcs and created other foul creatures. He told himself he was bringing order to Morgoth's realm, making it function properly, ensuring that resources were not wasted and efforts were coordinated. He did not let himself think too deeply about the suffering involved, the slaves laboring in the forges, the prisoners tortured in the dungeons, the corruption of living beings into monsters. Or perhaps he did think about it, and told himself it was necessary. This was the price of order, the cost of perfection. Those who would not submit to proper authority had to be compelled. Those who resisted the true order of things had to be broken or removed. It was all for the greater good, for the ultimate vision of a world perfected and controlled. The Wars of Beleriand began, the long struggle between Morgoth and the elves who had come to Middle-earth. Sauron commanded armies, led sieges, fought in great battles. He was a powerful warrior as well as a craftsman, able to assume terrible forms and wield force that few could withstand. But more than his strength in battle, it was his cunning that made him dangerous. He could deceive and manipulate, appearing in fair forms when it suited him, offering false treaties and alliances, corrupting those who let their guard down. He became known as Gorthor, the Cruel, among the elves, feared and hated for his treachery and his terrible works. Yet even then, even as he committed horrors in Morgoth's name, Sauron believed himself justified. He was not evil, he told himself. He was simply strong enough to do what was necessary, wise enough to see past sentiment to the hard truths of order and control. The elves were rebels and fools, clinging to outdated notions of freedom and individual will, unable to see the beauty of perfect submission to a single organizing intelligence. Deep in his heart, though, in places he did not examine too closely, Sauron knew he had become something other than what he was made to be. The Mairon, who had loved beauty and craft for their own sake, was gone, replaced by Sauron, who loved only power and control. But he could not admit this even to himself, for to do so would be to acknowledge that he had fallen, that all his justifications were hollow. So he continued on the path he had chosen, serving Morgoth faithfully, becoming ever more terrible and ever more lost, until the day would come when Morgoth himself would fall and Sauron would face a choice once again: return and face judgment, or continue down the dark path alone. But that day was still far off, and the Wars of Beleriand raged on, and Sauron worked his evil in Morgoth's name, believing still that he was serving order and perfection, blind to the truth that he had become a servant only of domination and tyranny, the very things he had once despised when he saw them in unvarnished form. The corruption was complete. Mairon was gone. Only Sauron remained. The Wars of Beleriand lasted for 6 centuries, a time of glory and grief for the elves, of power and ultimate defeat for Morgoth. Great deeds were done, and terrible losses suffered. Heroes rose and fell, kingdoms were founded and destroyed, and through it all Sauron served his master faithfully, if such service can be called faithful when it consists of treachery and cruelty. Sauron held Tol Ingarhoth, the Isle of Werewolves, formerly known as Tol Sirion, a fair island with a tower built by the elves. He had taken it through treachery and made it a place of horror, filling it with wolves and fell beasts. From there, he commanded the northern front of Morgoth's war, capturing prisoners and sending intelligence to Angband. It was here that he faced one of his few defeats during the Wars of Beleriand. Beren, a mortal man, and Luthien, daughter of an elf lord and a Maia, came to his tower seeking passage. Luthien was mighty in her own right, and her power, drawn from her divine heritage and her love for Beren, proved greater than Sauron's strength. In the battle that followed, she defeated him, and he fled from the tower in the form of a great vampire bat, humiliated and diminished. It was a moment that taught Sauron an important lesson. Direct confrontation with beings of great power was not always wise. Better to work through deception and long planning than to risk defeat in open battle. This lesson would serve him well in ages to come. The war ground on until finally the Valar themselves intervened. They could no longer stand by while Morgoth destroyed Beleriand and threatened to corrupt all of Middle-earth. The host of the Valar came out of the west, and in the War of Wrath, they broke Morgoth's power utterly. Angband was destroyed, torn down to its foundations, and Morgoth himself was captured and cast through the door of night into the timeless void, there to remain until the end of all things. Sauron had not been present at the final battle. When he saw that Morgoth's defeat was inevitable, he went into hiding, fleeing east and south, far from the wreckage of Angband. He took on a fair form and concealed himself, hoping to escape the notice of the Valar, and for a time he did more than hide. He repented. Not fully, perhaps, not deeply enough to take the action he knew he should, but he felt genuine remorse for what he had done and become. The Mairon he had been was not entirely dead, and in the aftermath of Morgoth's fall, that old self stirred and mourned. Eärnwë, the herald of Manwë, came to Middle-earth as the representative of the Valar to receive the submission of those who had served Morgoth. Sauron presented himself before Eärnwë, no longer in a terrible form, but as he had once appeared in Valinor, fair and wise. He admitted his crimes and expressed remorse, and it seemed he might yet be redeemed. But Eärnwë told him that he did not have the authority to pardon one of the Maia who had fallen so far. Sauron would have to return to Valinor and stand before the judgment of Manwë himself, and there receive whatever sentence the Elder King deemed appropriate. And here Sauron's pride, that fatal flaw, reasserted itself. To return to Valinor as a penitent, to humble himself before those he had once counted as peers, to face the shame and punishment he knew he deserved, this was too much. His remorse was real, but it was not strong enough to overcome his pride. He told himself that his repentance should be enough, that he should not have to debase himself before the Valar. He convinced himself that he could make amends through his own efforts, that he could prove his reformation through deeds rather than through submission to judgment. It was a rationalization, a way of avoiding the difficult path of true repentance. So Sauron fled once more, this time not from battle, but from judgment. He hid himself in Middle-earth, and as the years passed and no punishment came, he began to think himself safe. The Valar had withdrawn again after the War of Wrath, taking the elves who wished to go to Valinor with them. Much of Beleriand had been broken and sunk beneath the waves in the cataclysm of the war. What remained of Middle-earth was left largely to its own devices. For 1,000 years, Sauron remained in hiding, watching and waiting. During this time, he wrestled with himself, with what he had been and what he had become, with what he might yet be. The world was wounded and chaotic after the Great War, and part of him, the part that still remembered being Mairon, genuinely wished to help heal it. But another part of him, the part that had grown strong under Morgoth's influence, looked at the chaos and saw opportunity. The elves were diminished, many of them having left for Valinor. Men were numerous but scattered and primitive, easy to influence. There was no strong authority imposing order on Middle-earth. Sauron began to think about order again, about his old dream of a world perfected and controlled. Without Morgoth, he told himself, it could be done rightly. Morgoth had been chaotic and destructive at heart, for all his talk of domination. But Sauron was different. He truly did understand order, truly did have the knowledge to organize and improve the world. He told himself he would be a benevolent ruler, that his control would be for the good of all. Those who submitted to his guidance would prosper. He would eliminate war and suffering by eliminating the freedom that led to conflict. It would be perfect, peaceful, ordered. And if some resisted, well, that would be unfortunate. But the greater good would require their submission or removal. In this way, Sauron rationalized his way back to his old path. He convinced himself that he could pursue domination with pure motives, that control could be benevolent if wielded by one wise enough. He did not see, or refused to see, that this was exactly the lie Morgoth had used to corrupt him in the first place. Around the year 500 of the Second Age, Sauron emerged from hiding. He no longer used the name Sauron, for that was a name given by enemies. Instead, he called himself Annatar, which means Lord of Gifts in the Elvish tongue. He took on a fair appearance, beautiful and wise, radiating knowledge and goodwill. He went first to Lindon, where Gil-galad, the High King of the Noldor, held court. But Gil-galad, wise and discerning, did not trust him. Perhaps he sensed something false beneath the fair exterior, or perhaps he simply remembered the treacheries of the Wars of Beleriand too well. He refused Annatar's offer of assistance and turned him away. So Sauron went to Eregion, a realm founded by Celebrimbor, grandson of Feanor, who had made the Silmarils. Celebrimbor was the greatest craftsman among the elves of that age, surpassing even his grandfather in some arts, and he had gathered around him a fellowship of smiths and jewelwrights called the Gwaith-i-Myrddin, the people of the jewel smiths. Here, Annatar found a more receptive audience. Celebrimbor and his people were hungry for knowledge, eager to create works of wonder and beauty. When Annatar came offering to teach them, offering to share the secrets of crafting that he had learned from Aulë himself in the days before his fall, they welcomed him. Sauron was careful. He did not reveal his true identity, and he genuinely did teach them much of value. His knowledge was real, his skills undeniable, and the works that the smiths of Eregion created under his tutelage were beautiful and powerful. He made himself invaluable, a trusted friend and counselor, particularly to Celebrimbor. But all the while, he was working toward his true goal. He began to speak to them of greater works, of the possibility of creating objects that would preserve and enhance, that would protect against the decay of time. The elves were immortal, yes, but they were bound to the world, and the world was marred and changing. What if there could be sanctuaries, places protected from change, where beauty and order could be preserved forever? The idea appealed to Celebrimbor and the other smiths. They began to experiment with rings, for a ring was a perfect symbol, a circle with no beginning or end, a shape of eternity and binding. Under Annatar's guidance, they created many lesser rings, learning the craft, perfecting the art of preservation and enhancement. Then came the great work. Together, Celebrimbor and Annatar would create rings of power, greater than anything that had been made before. There would be 9 for men, who above all else desired power and life unending. There would be 7 for the dwarf lords who loved craft and treasure. And there would be 3, the greatest for the elves themselves, to preserve their realms against the fading of the world. Celebrimbor forged the three himself, without Anatar's direct touch, making them the purest and most powerful. He created Vilya, mightiest of all, which had power over the air, and later would be born by Gil-galad and then Elrond. He made Narya, the Ring of Fire, which would be given to Círdan the Shipwright and later to Gandalf. And he wrought Nenya, the Ring of Water, which Galadriel would bear, preserving Lothlorien through its power. The 9 and the 7 were made with Anatar's help, and into them he poured his knowledge of binding and control. They seemed fair enough, granting power and preservation to their bearers, but they had a flaw hidden deep in their making, a vulnerability that Sauron had built into them, though Celebrimbor did not know it, for Sauron had a plan within a plan. While the elven smiths worked in Eregion, he had been making preparations of his own in secret. He had chosen a land far to the east, a black country called Mordor surrounded by mountains. There, in a volcano he called Mount Doom. In the fires of Orodruin he would forge a master ring, a one ring that would control all the others. He labored in secret for years on this project, and it was perhaps the greatest work of craftsmanship ever undertaken by any being in Middle-earth, save only the Silmarils themselves. Into the One Ring he poured a vast portion of his own power, his very essence, binding himself to it and it to him. The ring would be an extension of his will, a tool of domination unlike anything that had been made before. The spells he wove into it were complex beyond measure. It would control the other rings of power, dominating them and their bearers. It would grant its wielder immense power and authority. It would preserve its bearer from harm and decay. And most importantly, it would bend all wills to its master, making the wearer the absolute ruler of all who fell under its influence. On the day he completed it, and first placed it upon his finger, Sauron spoke the words he had inscribed upon it in the Black Speech, a language he had devised for his servants. Arahe Ashnazgdur Batuluk, Ashnaz Gimbatul, Ashnaz Thrakatuluk or Burzumishi Krimpatul. In the common tongue, this means one ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. The moment he put on the ring and spoke these words, his deception was revealed. Every bearer of the rings of power felt his presence and understood his betrayal. The elves, most of all, knew immediately what had happened. Celebrimbor tore off his ring in horror and anger, understanding too late that his trusted friend and teacher had been Sauron all along, that all his gifts had been part of a scheme to enslave the free peoples of Middle-earth. Sauron's fair disguise was ended. The elves would never trust him again, and he could no longer appear as Anatar, for that name was now known for a lie. His first great deception had succeeded in part, for he had the ring and had corrupted the 9 and the 7, but it had also failed, for the elves had escaped his trap, and the 3 rings remained free of his direct control, hidden away and used only to preserve and protect, never to dominate. War would come soon, terrible and destructive. But Sauron had his ring now, his precious creation, the embodiment of his will and his power. With it, he believed, he would eventually bring all of Middle-earth under his control, creating the perfect order he had dreamed of for so long. He did not yet understand the trap he had made for himself, that by putting so much of his power into the ring, he had bound his fate to it irrevocably. If the ring were destroyed, he would be diminished beyond recovery. But he could not imagine anyone having the strength to destroy it, could not conceive of anyone willingly throwing away such power. And so, Sauron prepared for war, gathering his forces in Mordor, building his great fortress of Barad-dûr with the ring's power, confident that this time his rule would be established forever. The revelation of Sauron's betrayal sent shockwaves through the elven realms. Celebrimbor, devastated by the deception, immediately hid the three rings, ensuring they would never fall into Sauron's hands. He gave Villier and Narya to Gil-galad for safekeeping, while Nenya went to Galadriel in Lothlorien. These three would never be worn openly, while Sauron held the one, for their bearers could sense his will through the connection he had forged. But the 9 and the 7 were different. These had been made with Sauron's direct help, and his corruption went deeper into their making. The 9 had been given to great lords and warriors among men, those who desired power and feared death above all things. The 7 went to the dwarf lords, one to each of the 7 clans, for the dwarves were master craftsmen and loved works of beauty and treasure. At first, the rings seemed to fulfill their promise. Those who wore them found their power enhanced, their lives extended, their abilities magnified. The men who bore the 9 became mighty sorcerers and kings, ruling vast territories and commanding great armies. The dwarf lords who held the 7 found their treasure houses grow beyond measure, delving deeper and crafting greater works than ever before. But the rings were poison disguised as gifts, and slowly, inevitably, they worked their corruption. The 9 men found themselves drawn ever more tightly. Under Sauron's will, their lives were extended, yes, but at a terrible cost. They began to fade, becoming neither living nor dead, existing in a twilight realm between the mortal world and the shadow realm where Sauron's will was absolute. Over centuries, they transformed completely, becoming the Nazgûl, the Ring-Wraiths, Sauron's most terrible servants. They had no will of their own anymore, only the will of their master channeled through the 9 rings and the one. They could not be killed by normal means, for they were no longer truly alive. They spread fear wherever they went, their very presence a terror to the hearts of mortals. The greatest of them had once been a king of Númenor, a man of noble lineage before his fall. Now, he was the Witch King of Angmar, the Lord of the Nazgûl, Sauron's chief captain and most feared warrior. The others too had been great in their time, but their names were forgotten, lost to the shadow they had become. The dwarves proved harder to dominate. They were made by Aulë rather than by Eru himself, fashioned from stone and given life afterward, and something in their nature made them resistant to outside control. The 7 rings could not turn them into wraiths or bend their wills directly to Sauron's service. Instead, the rings inflamed the dwarf's natural love of treasure into an all-consuming greed. The lords who bore them became obsessed with gathering wealth, mining ever deeper, growing ever more possessive of their hoards. This greed brought doom to many dwarf holds, for their deep mining awakened ancient evils sleeping in the roots of mountains, and their vast treasures drew the envy and attacks of dragons and other foul creatures. Over time, some of the seven were lost or destroyed. Dragons consumed some along with their bearers. Others were reclaimed by Sauron through trickery or force. But even those that remained free continued to work their slow poison, contributing to the decline of the dwarf kingdoms through the ages. Sauron, meanwhile, had been busy building his realm in Mordor. The land itself seemed to reflect its master's nature, a volcanic wasteland surrounded by mountains, hostile to normal life, perfect for the breeding of armies and the forging of weapons. The great volcano Mount Doom stood in the center of the plateau of Gorgoroth, its fires never cooling, belching smoke and ash into the sky. Using the power of the One Ring, Sauron raised Barad-dûr, the Dark Tower, the mightiest fortress ever built in Middle-earth. It rose impossibly high, its foundations going deep into the mountain rock, its pinnacle reaching above the clouds. From the highest chamber, Sauron could look out across all of Mordor and far beyond, his will extending through the ring to touch the minds of his servants and enemies alike. The building of Barad-dûr took centuries, for even with the ring's power, such a work was immense. Sauron drove his slaves mercilessly, bringing stone from distant quarries, iron from mines in the mountains, and binding it all together with his dark sorcery. When it was complete, it stood as a monument to his power and his will, a physical manifestation of his desire to dominate all Middle-earth. But even as he built his fortress, war came to him sooner than he expected. The elves had not remained idle after discovering his treachery. Celebrimbor had rallied the forces of Eregion, and Gil-galad had sent armies from Lindon to support him. They meant to destroy Sauron before he could consolidate his power, to crush him while they still had the strength to do so. This began the War of the Elves and Sauron, a conflict that would rage for years and reshape the map of Middle-earth. Sauron's forces were numerous and terrible. He had been breeding orcs in Mordor, creating new strains larger and more vicious than those Morgoth had made. He had wolves and trolls, and the Nazgûl were beginning to take their final form as wraiths. But the elves were still mighty in those days, and they had allies among men. The war went badly for Sauron at first. His armies were driven back, and Celebrimbor's forces pressed toward Mordor itself. For a time, it seemed the elves might triumph, might destroy Sauron and recover the ring before it was too late. Then Sauron revealed the full extent of his cunning and his cruelty. He could not defeat the elves in open battle, not yet, so he changed tactics. He struck suddenly at Eregion itself, sending a fast-moving army through hidden passes while the main elven force was far to the east. The realm of the elven smiths was caught unprepared. Eregion fell in ruin. The fellowship of smiths was scattered or slain. Celebrimbor himself was captured and tortured, for Sauron wanted to know where he had hidden the three rings. The elven lord endured torment beyond imagining, but revealed nothing, protecting the location of the three even unto death. Finally, Sauron killed him, and his body was used as a banner by Sauron's forces, a cruel mockery of the one who had been his friend, and then his most hated enemy. The destruction of Eregion sent shockwaves through the elven realms. Refugees fled west, many going to a hidden valley where Elrond, herald of Gil-galad, established a refuge that would later become Rivendell. The war had turned decisively in Sauron's favor, and he pressed his advantage, driving westward toward the sea. It seemed that all of Eregion would fall to him, that he would sweep over the elven realms and establish his dominion over all the western lands. But then a new power entered the war, one that Sauron had not fully accounted for. Númenor. The island kingdom of Númenor lay far to the west in the Great Sea. It had been given to the Edain, those men who had fought alongside the elves in the Wars of Beleriand, as a reward for their faithfulness. The Númenorians were blessed with long life and great wisdom, and they had become the mightiest of all the kingdoms of men. When they heard of Sauron's war against the elves, and particularly of the threat to Lindon where Gil-galad ruled, the king of Númenor sent a great fleet to Middle-earth. Tar-Minastir commanded the expedition himself, bringing such a host of warriors and ships that the very sight of their sails on the horizon filled Sauron's armies with dread. The Númenorians landed at the mouth of the river Guatlo, and immediately marched to meet Sauron's forces. The battle that followed was catastrophic for the Dark Lord. His armies were not prepared to face the tall warriors of Númenor, clad in their bright mail and wielding weapons of superior craft. The Númenorians fought with discipline and skill that rivaled the elves, and their numbers were overwhelming. Sauron's forces were shattered. The orcs broke and fled, and even the Nazgûl withdrew before the onslaught. Sauron himself barely escaped, fleeing back to Mordor with only a remnant of his army. The war was over, and he had lost. He retreated behind the mountains of Mordor and licked his wounds. Barad-dûr still stood, and he still held the One Ring, so his power was not broken completely. But he had learned hard lessons. He could not conquer Middle-earth through open war alone, not while Númenor remained strong and the elves still had the will to resist. So he changed his approach. If he could not conquer Númenor, perhaps he could corrupt it. If he could not defeat the great kingdom of men through force, perhaps he could destroy it from within. And so he began to plan his greatest deception yet, one that would require patience and subtlety beyond anything he had attempted before. For 500 years he remained relatively quiet in Mordor, rebuilding his strength, watching Númenor from afar, learning its politics and its people. He saw how the Númenorians had begun to grow proud, how they chafed at the ban that forbade them from sailing to the undying lands in the west. He saw their fear of death despite their long lives, their envy of the elves' immortality, and in all of this he saw opportunity. The seeds of Númenor's downfall were already present in the hearts of its people. All he needed to do was water them, tend them, help them grow. And when the time was right, When Númenor was ripe for the harvest, he would strike, not with armies, but with words, with lies dressed up as truth, with the oldest and most effective weapon in his arsenal, the corruption of good intentions into evil ends. The ring sat heavy on his finger, a constant reminder of his power and his purpose. Through it, he could feel the nine, could command the will-less wraiths who bore them. The seven remained mostly beyond his direct control, but they still served his purpose, spreading greed and discord among the dwarves. And the three, though hidden, were still connected to the one, still part of his grand design. Sauron looked out from Barad-dûr across the wastelands of Mordor and smiled, a terrible expression on his dark form. He had suffered a setback, yes, but he was immortal, patient, and utterly committed to his vision. The ring had cost him much, binding a great portion of his power into its golden circle, but it had also made him mightier than he had ever been. He would wait. He would watch. And when the moment came, when Númenor stood at the height of its pride and the depth of its fear, he would strike. Not with armies or with fire, but with poison more subtle and more deadly than any sword. The Second Age was only half over, and there was still much to unfold. The rings of power had been made, and they would work their slow corruption through the centuries. The foundations of future doom were being laid, one stone at a time, one choice at a time, one small compromise with darkness at a time. And at the center of it all, binding it together, giving it purpose and direction, was the One Ring, and the terrible will of the one who had made it, who wore it, who had poured himself into it so completely that he could never truly be separated from it again. Sauron's greatest strength and his ultimate weakness, all bound up in a simple band of gold, forged in fire, inscribed with words of power, waiting for the day when it would either grant him dominion over all Middle-earth or bring about his final and irrevocable destruction. Nearly 1,000 years passed after Sauron's defeat by the Númenorians. During this time, the island kingdom grew ever greater in power and splendor, but also in pride and discontent. The Númenorians built mighty ships and explored all the coasts of Middle-earth, establishing colonies and trading posts. They brought gifts of knowledge and craft to the lesser men of the continent, teaching them agriculture and smithing, healing and building. But their hearts had begun to change. The early Númenorians had been content with their blessed isle and their long lives, grateful for the gifts they had been given. But as the centuries passed, each generation lived slightly less long than the one before, and the shadow of death, however distant, grew more troubling to them. They began to look westward toward Valinor with envy rather than reverence, questioning why the elves should be immortal while they, who had been so faithful, should still have to die. The kings of Númenor began to speak less in Elvish and more in the common tongue of men. They grew jealous of their years and sought to extend them by any means, hoarding their days like misers hoard gold. They abandoned the old friendship with the elves, seeing in them only a reminder of what they themselves could never have: life unending. Sauron watched all of this from Mordor, and he was pleased. The corruption was happening on its own, without any intervention from him. He had only to wait for the right moment to act, to appear at the perfect time when Númenor was ripe for his poison. That moment came when Ar-Pharazôn became king, the 25th and last king of Númenor. He was the mightiest and proudest of all the Númenorian rulers, a great warrior and commander who had won many victories. But his pride was immense, and he could not bear the thought that any should be counted greater than himself. When he heard that Sauron had declared himself king of men in Middle-earth, claiming dominion over all the lands the Númenorians had explored, Ar-Pharazôn was enraged. How dare this upstart, this ancient enemy, claim such titles? He would teach Sauron who truly ruled Middle-earth. So Ar-Pharazôn gathered the greatest fleet Númenor had ever assembled, an armada so vast that its sails covered the sea like clouds covering the sky. He sailed to Middle-earth and landed at Umbar in the south, and the host he brought was so overwhelming that the very earth trembled beneath their march. Sauron had been expecting war, had prepared his armies to meet the Númenorians in battle as before. But when he saw the host that Ar-Pharazôn had brought, when he witnessed the might of Númenor at its very peak, even he was daunted. His own forces, orcs and men in his service, deserted at the sight of the Númenorian army, fleeing in terror. In that moment, Sauron realized that he could not win through force of arms, but rather than despair, he saw opportunity. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the chance to strike at Númenor itself, and so he did something that shocked his own servants. He surrendered. Sauron came forth from Barad-dûr and presented himself before Ar-Pharazôn in chains, humbling himself before the king of Númenor. He declared that he had been wrong to claim such titles, that he acknowledged Ar-Pharazôn as the greatest of all kings, and that he submitted himself completely to the king's judgment. Some of Ar-Pharazôn's counselors were suspicious. They advised the king to reject Sauron's surrender, to leave him in Middle-earth, or better yet, to execute him and be done with the threat he represented. But Ar-Pharazôn was pleased by Sauron's submission, and saw in it an acknowledgment of his own superiority. He decided to bring Sauron back to Númenor as a hostage and a trophy, a living proof of his power and glory. It was exactly what Sauron had hoped for. He went to Númenor willingly, wearing his chains as a victor might wear laurels, for he knew that he had already won. He had done what no enemy army could do. He had gained entrance to the very heart of the kingdom of Númenor. At first, he was indeed a prisoner, kept under guard and brought forth only when the king wished to display him. But Sauron was patient and subtle. He made himself useful, offering counsel on various matters, always flattering Ar-Pharazôn's pride, always presenting his suggestions as ways to increase the king's glory and power. His advice was sound, his knowledge vast, and slowly the king began to rely on him. Within a few years, Sauron had gone from prisoner to counselor, and his influence grew with each passing season. He understood the hearts of the Númenorians better than they understood themselves, knew exactly what lies to tell them because they were lies they wanted to believe. He spoke to them of their greatness, of how they were being cheated of their birthright. The Valar, he suggested, were jealous of men, feared their potential, and so had deceived them with talk of a gift of mortality. In truth, death was a punishment, not a gift, and one that could be overcome by those strong enough and wise enough to seize what was rightfully theirs. The undying lands in the west, he whispered, were not forbidden because they were holy, but because the Valar wanted to keep their immortality for themselves and their elven favorites. Any man who set foot on those shores would gain the immortality of the elves. The ban was not divine law, but merely tyranny, the strong denying the weak what they desired. These lies fell on fertile ground. The Númenóreans wanted to believe them because they offered what the people most desired, escape from death and validation of their pride. Slowly, the old ways were abandoned. The worship of Eru was forbidden, his temple defiled. The white tree gift of the elves was neglected and then cut down. In its place, Sauron encouraged the building of a great temple to Melkor, whom he now openly praised as the true king of the world. There were still faithful Númenóreans who resisted this corruption. They gathered in secret, preserving the old knowledge and the old ways, waiting and hoping for deliverance. Chief among them was Amandil, Lord of Andunia, and his son Elendil. They watched in horror as Númenor descended into darkness and tyranny, but they were powerless to stop it, for the king's guards would arrest or execute any who spoke against Sauron's counsel. Sauron introduced human sacrifice to Númenor, something that would have been unthinkable in earlier times. In the great temple of Melkor, prisoners and even Númenórean citizens who clung to the old faith were burned alive, offerings to the Dark Lord, who Sauron claimed would grant his worshippers power and life. The smoke of these burnings rose continually from the temple, a dark pillar reaching toward the sky. Ar-Pharazôn, desperate to escape death as his years finally began to weigh upon him, listened ever more eagerly to Sauron's counsel. And Sauron, seeing that the corruption was complete, suggested the final fatal step. Let the king of Númenor sail west with a great armada and claim the undying lands by force. Let him make war upon the Valar themselves and seize the immortality they had denied him. It was madness, blasphemy against Eru himself, but Ar-Pharazôn was beyond reason. He gathered the greatest fleet Númenor could muster, conscripting every able-bodied man, emptying the island of its defenders. Only the faithful were left behind, too few in number to resist, watching helplessly as the king led the might of Númenor to its doom. When the fleet sailed west, Sauron remained in Númenor. He stood atop the temple of Melkor and laughed, for he knew what was coming. The Valar had been patient, had endured much, but this they could not permit. Men were not meant to enter the undying lands in an army, sailing to make war upon the powers themselves could not be allowed to succeed. As Ar-Pharazôn's fleet approached the shores of Valinor, the Valar laid down their guardianship of the world and called upon Eru himself to act. And Eru responded. The world itself changed in that moment, bent and broken by divine will. A great chasm opened in the sea, and the fleet of Númenor fell into it, every ship and every man tumbling into the abyss. The island of Númenor itself was struck by waves higher than mountains. The land buckled and broke, sliding beneath the sea in a cataclysm of fire and water. The greatest kingdom of men in Middle-earth was destroyed utterly in a single day, drowned beneath the waves, leaving only a few scattered islands as remnants of what had been. Sauron's body was destroyed in that cataclysm. The fair form he had worn, the shape he had used to deceive the Númenóreans, was burned away. His spirit fled eastward across the sea to Middle-earth, diminished and weakened, but not destroyed, for he had bound his life to the One Ring, and the ring endured. But he had lost something precious in Númenor's fall. Never again could he take a fair form. The shape he had worn as Annatar, the beauty he had used to deceive the elves and the Númenóreans, was gone forever. When he reformed his body in Mordor, it was as a being of terror and shadow, a dark lord whose very presence inspired fear. Yet even in this defeat, Sauron had achieved much of what he desired. Númenor was destroyed. The greatest power that could have opposed him was gone. The world had been changed, made round instead of flat, and the straight road to Valinor was removed from it, available only to the elves and those granted special grace. Not all the Númenóreans had perished. Elendil the Tall had escaped, with his sons, Isildur and Anarion, and a small fleet of ships carrying the faithful and remnants of Númenor's ancient glory. They had sailed east before the cataclysm, and they landed in Middle-earth, where they established kingdoms in exile, Arna in the north and Gondor in the south. With them they brought seedlings of the White Tree, ancient heirlooms and weapons, and most importantly, the 7 seeing stones, the Palantiri, which allowed communication across vast distances. They built their kingdoms as new Númenor in all but name, preserving what they could of the old lore and wisdom, and they did not forget who had brought about their homeland's destruction. Sauron was their great enemy, the deceiver who had corrupted their people and led them to ruin. When Elendil and Gil-galad formed their alliance, it was with the specific purpose of destroying Sauron utterly, ensuring he could never threaten the free peoples again. But Sauron had also been preparing. In the years after his return to Mordor, he rebuilt Barad-dûr, making it even stronger than before. He gathered new armies, breeding orcs in greater numbers, calling to himself all the evil things that dwelt in the dark places of the world. The 9 Nazgûl came to him, and he armed them with weapons of terror, making them his chief captains. The ring was his strength and his anchor. Through it, he poured his will into Barad-dûr, into Mordor itself, binding the land to him as he had bound the 9 to his service. The very air of Mordor became poisonous to good things, and the sky above it was perpetually dark with clouds of ash and smoke. When he looked upon what he had built, Sauron felt satisfaction. Yes, he had lost his fair form, and yes, the destruction of Númenor had cost him greatly in power. But he was still mighty, still master of vast forces, and now the greatest kingdom of men was gone. Only the elves and the small realms of the Dúnedain, the survivors of Númenor, stood against him. He did not yet know that from his greatest triumph would come the seeds of his greatest defeat, that the survivors of Númenor would prove more dangerous than their proud forebears, for they had learned humility and wisdom from their people's fall. They had seen where pride and the lust for power led, and they had turned away from that path. The stage was set for the final confrontation of the Second Age. The last alliance would soon form, and the greatest battle Middle-earth had yet seen would be fought on the plains before the Black Gate. Sauron prepared for war, confident in his strength, never imagining that he could be defeated while he wore the ring. The sunset of the Second Age was at hand, and with it would come fire and death, triumph and tragedy, and a victory that would prove incomplete, sowing the seeds for conflicts that would not be resolved for 3,000 years more. From the highest chamber of Barad-dûr, Sauron looked out across Mordor and beyond, and he smiled his terrible smile, for he believed the final victory was at hand. The call went out across Middle-earth in the year 3430 of the Second Age. From Lindon in the far west to the borders of Mordor in the east, the free peoples were summoned to war. Gil-galad, High King of the Noldor, and Elendil, the tall High King of Arnor and Gondor, had formed an alliance, the last great alliance of elves and men, and they called upon all who loved freedom to join them in what would be the final confrontation with Sauron. The response was overwhelming. From every elven realm came warriors, from Lindon and Rivendell, from the woodland realm of Orifer in Greenwood the Great, from Lothlorien, where the Lady Galadriel kept watch. They came in their bright mail, and with their fair faces set in grim determination, knowing that this war would cost them dearly, but knowing also that it had to be fought. The men of Arnor and Gondor marched under the banner of Elendil, and with them came men from many other lands who had no love for the Dark Lord. Even some of the dwarves joined the alliance, though they had long remained isolated in their mountain halls, for they remembered the evil that the Seven Rings had brought them, and had no wish to see Sauron's power grow greater. The host that gathered was vast, the greatest army ever assembled in Middle-earth. They marched eastward through Eregion and across the misty mountains, their passage like the movement of a great river flowing toward the sea. Gil-galad bore Egelos, his great spear that no enemy could withstand, while Elendil wielded Narsil, the sword of Elendil's line, a blade of ancient craft and power. But among all the weapons and artifacts the Alliance carried, none were more significant than the 3 elven rings that remained hidden from Sauron. Gil-galad bore Vilya, the mightiest of the 3, while Galadriel wore Nenya in Lothlorien, and Círdan the shipwright held Narya, the Ring of Fire. These rings could not be used to dominate or control, for that was not their nature, but they could preserve and protect, maintaining the courage of the Alliance even in the face of overwhelming darkness. Sauron was aware of the gathering army, of course. Through the Nazgul and his many spies, he watched the Alliance's progress. He was not concerned. Let them come, he thought. Let them dash themselves against the mountains of Mordor and the gates of Barad-dûr. He had armies beyond counting, and he wore the One Ring. No power in Middle-earth could stand against him. He sent forth his own forces to meet the Alliance in the valley of Dagorlad, the battle plain, which lay before the Black Gate of Mordor. There, on that broad plain, the 2 hosts met in a battle that would be remembered until the end of days. The Battle of Dagorlad lasted for months. It was not a single engagement. but a prolonged campaign with thousands upon thousands dying every day. The plain became a wasteland of corpses and broken weapons, the ground so soaked with blood that nothing would grow there for ages to come. Later, it would be called the Dead Marshes, for the bodies of the slain sank into the marsh waters, and their faces could be seen beneath the surface, preserved by some dark sorcery, bearing witness forever to the horror of that battle. The elves fought with the skill and grace of immortal warriors, their bright swords cutting through ranks of orcs like farmers cutting wheat. The men fought with desperate courage, knowing that if they failed, all Middle-earth would fall under the shadow. The dwarves held the line against the trolls and other great beasts, their axes and hammers crushing bone and armor alike. Against them, Sauron's forces came in waves that seemed endless. Orcs in numbers beyond counting, bred in the pits of Mordor for war and nothing else. Trolls from the mountains, enormous and terrible, wielding clubs the size of tree trunks. The Nazgul rode forth on fell beasts, spreading terror wherever they flew, their very presence causing brave warriors to flee in panic. But the alliance held. Gil-galad's leadership was inspired, and Elendil's courage never wavered. They fought side by side, elf and man, just as their ancestors had done in the Wars of Beleriand, and their unity was a strength that Sauron had not fully accounted for. Orifer, king of the woodland elves, fell in the battle, along with a great portion of his host, charging too eagerly into the enemy lines. His death was a grievous loss, but his son Thranduil survived and continued to fight. Many other great lords and captains fell on both sides, for the battle of Dagorlad was fought without mercy or quarter. Finally, after months of slaughter, the alliance broke through. They drove Sauron's armies back to the Black Gate and beyond, pursuing them onto the plateau of Gorgoroth itself. The gate was breached, and the host of the alliance poured into Mordor, bringing light into that dark land for the first time in ages. But Sauron was not defeated yet. He withdrew to Barad-dûr, and the alliance laid siege to his great fortress. For 7 years, 7 long years, they maintained that siege. It was a grinding, terrible time, with the armies camped on the barren plain before the Dark Tower, constantly harassed by sorties from the fortress, wearing down slowly under the oppressive shadow of Mordor. Food became scarce. Disease spread through the camps. Warriors who had survived the great battle died in glorious deaths from hunger or sickness or despair. The shadow of Barad-dûr seemed to press down upon them, and the ring's power protected the tower, making its walls impregnable to any assault. Yet the alliance endured. They maintained the siege through all 7 years, their determination never quite breaking, their hope preserved by the hidden power of the 3 rings and by their faith in their leaders. Gil-galad and Elendil kept their people's spirits alive, reminding them of what they fought for, of the world that could be if only they could hold on a little longer. Finally, Sauron himself emerged. Perhaps he had grown impatient with the siege, or perhaps he believed the alliance was weak enough that he could break them with a single blow. He came forth from Barad-dûr in all his terrible majesty, a being of shadow and flame, wearing the One Ring openly, his power radiating from him in waves of heat and darkness. The very ground trembled as he strode onto the battlefield. Orcs and other fell creatures rallied to him, pouring out of Barad-dûr in one final desperate assault. The battle that followed was beyond anything that had come before. Sauron himself wielded a great mace, and where he struck, warriors fell, their armor crushed, their bodies broken. But Gil-galad and Elendil did not flee. They advanced to meet him, these two greatest of all the leaders of their peoples, knowing that this was the moment upon which everything depended. If Sauron could be defeated here, the war would be won. If they failed, all hope would be lost. The duel that followed passed into legend. Gil-galad wielded Eglos with the skill of an elf lord who had lived for thousands of years, fighting in wars beyond counting. Elendil swung Narsil with the strength and courage of the Númenorian blood at its finest, standing taller and stronger than any man born before or since. Against them both, Sauron fought with the power of a corrupted Maia, a being of the same order as the wizards who would later come to Middle-earth, but fallen into darkness and amplified by the ring's power. His mace crushed shields and shattered swords. The heat that radiated from him was like standing before a forge, and the darkness that surrounded him was like the night itself made solid. They fought on the slopes of Mount Doom with the fires of Orodruin burning behind them. The clash of their weapons rang across Mordor like thunder. Lesser warriors on both sides paused to watch, for this was a contest that would decide the fate of the age. Gil-galad struck with his spear, and the point bit deep into Sauron's form, burning with a light that made the darkness recoil. But Sauron's heat was terrible, and the elf lord was burned even as his spear found its mark. Elendil struck with Narsil, the blade cutting through shadow and armor alike, wounding Sauron grievously. But Sauron's mace fell upon them both. Gil-galad fell, his beautiful face burned beyond recognition, dead before he hit the ground. Vilya, the mightiest of the three rings, passed from his hand later to be taken up by Elrond. Elendil was thrown down, his body broken, and Narsil shattered beneath him, breaking into pieces on the rock. Yet in that moment of triumph, Sauron had overextended himself. He stood over his fallen enemies, victorious but wounded, and he did not see Isildur, son of Elendil, approaching from behind. Isildur took up the hilt of Narsil, the broken blade that had been his father's. Even shattered, it still held power, still carried the edge that could cut through darkness. And with that broken blade, Isildur struck at Sauron's hand, the hand that bore the One Ring. The blade cut through flesh and bone, and the ring fell from Sauron's severed finger. In that instant, his power failed him. Without the ring, his body could not maintain its form. He screamed, a sound of rage and despair that shook the very foundations of Mordor, and then his spirit fled, abandoning the ruins of his physical form, fleeing into the shadows to hide and slowly rebuild. The war was over. Sauron was defeated. The armies of Mordor broke and fled, leaderless and demoralized. The siege of Barad-dûr was ended, and though the tower still stood, for it had been built with the ring's power and could not fall while the ring existed, it was empty now, abandoned, a monument to a power that had been overthrown. But the victory was not complete. Isildur stood holding the ring, feeling its weight, feeling the whisper of its power. Elrond, who had been herald to Gil-galad and had witnessed everything, approached him and counseled him to destroy it. They were standing on the slopes of Mount Doom, and the fires of Eregion still burned hot enough to unmake the ring. "Cast it into the fire," Elrond urged. "Destroy it now, while we have the chance. Only in those flames can the ring be destroyed, and while it exists, Sauron can never be truly defeated." But Isildur looked at the ring and could not bring himself to do it. Perhaps it was grief for his father, a desire to keep this one thing from the battle that had cost so much. Perhaps it was the ring's own power already beginning to work on him, its subtle corruption whispering that he should keep it, use it, that it was his by right of conquest. "No," Isildur said. "This is a weregild for my father's death, and for my brother's." For Anarion, Isildur's brother, had also fallen in the war. "I will keep it," and so the ring was not destroyed. Isildur took it with him back to the north, where he intended to make it an heirloom of his house. And in that decision, in that moment of weakness and pride, the seeds of future sorrow were planted. The alliance disbanded. The elves returned to their realms, diminished and grieving. So many had fallen: Gil-galad, Orifer, and countless others whose names deserve to be remembered, but were lost in the vastness of the slaughter. The men of Gondor and Arnor went home to rebuild their kingdoms, to bury their dead and try to heal from 7 years of war. Sauron was defeated, but not destroyed. His spirit lingered in Middle-earth, weak and formless, unable to take shape without the ring. He hid in the dark places of the world, slowly gathering strength over centuries and millennia, plotting his return, searching always for the ring that had been cut from his finger. And the ring itself, the One Ring, the instrument of so much suffering, and the key to Sauron's power, remained in the world, waiting for the day when it would betray the one who bore it, as it had betrayed all who came before. The Second Age ended not with Sauron's destruction, but with his defeat and banishment. It was a victory, but an incomplete one. And from that incompleteness would flow all the sorrows and struggles of the Third Age until, at last, 3,000 years later, the ring would find its way to the most unlikely hands, and the final confrontation between Sauron and the free peoples would be decided once and for all. The Third Age began with hope. Sauron was defeated, his armies scattered, and Mordor was left desolate and empty. The kingdoms of Arnor and Gondor stood strong, the last remnants of Númenorian glory watching over Middle-earth. The elves, though diminished, still maintained their realms. Rivendell, where Elrond now wore Vilya, the mightiest of the three. Lothlorien, where Galadriel bore Nenya, and the woodland realm of Thranduil in the great forest of Greenwood the Great. But the shadow was not gone, merely hidden, and the One Ring, which should have been destroyed in the fires of Mount Doom, remained in the world, a poison waiting to corrupt whoever possessed it. For 2 years Isildur kept the ring, wearing it as he journeyed north to take up the kingship of Arnor that was his by right. He discovered what others before him had learned, that the ring had a will of its own, that it was not merely a tool but a living thing in its own way, constantly seeking to return to its master. It betrayed him, as it betrayed all who bore it. As Isildur travelled north with a small company of warriors, they were ambushed by orcs in the valley of the Anduin River, at a place later called the Gladden Fields. The company was overwhelmed, and in desperation, Isildur put on the ring to escape, knowing it would make him invisible to mortal eyes. But the ring slipped from his finger as he swam the river, abandoning him to his fate. Without its protection, the orcs saw him and killed him with their black arrows. Isildur, last son of Elendil, High King of Arnor and Gondor, died in the muddy waters of the Anduin, and the ring sank into the riverbed, lost to the knowledge of all the peoples of Middle-earth. And there it lay for nearly 2,500 years, hidden in the mud and silt, slowly poisoning the waters around it, waiting for the chance to be found again. During those long years, Sauron's spirit slowly recovered. He could not take physical form without the ring, not a form of power and majesty as he once had. But he could gather his will, could begin to influence the world again in subtle ways. He fled far to the east, beyond the sight and knowledge of the elves and the Dunedain, and there he hid, planning and scheming. The kingdoms of men prospered for a time. Gondor grew mighty, pushing back the remnants of Sauron's servants, building great cities and fortresses. Minas Anor and Minas Ithil, the Tower of the Sun and the Tower of the Moon, stood watch over the borders. Arnor in the north was peaceful and prosperous, but the line of the kings began to fail. Without the ring to focus their attention on Sauron's threat, the Dunedain fell to squabbling among themselves. Arnor eventually split into 3 kingdoms, each claiming legitimacy, each weakening the others through division. One by one, these kingdoms fell to war, plague, and the long malice of Angmar, a realm of evil that arose in the north, though few at the time realized it was guided by Sauron's will. Gondor too faced troubles. The line of kings eventually failed, and the realm was ruled by stewards, noble men who governed in the king's name, but could not claim the throne themselves. The kingdom's borders slowly contracted under pressure from enemies on all sides. Easterlings from Rhûn, Haradrim from the south, and orcs from the mountains. Meanwhile, around the year 1000 of the Third Age, a shadow fell upon Greenwood the Great. The forest began to sicken, its southern reaches growing dark and tangled, filled with spiders and other foul creatures. The elves who dwelt there called it Mirkwood now, for it had become a place of darkness and fear. In the southern part of the forest, at a place called Dol Guldur, the Hill of Sorcery, an evil presence had taken up residence. The elves called this presence the Necromancer, and his power grew year by year, though none yet knew who or what he truly was. The Necromancer was, of course, Sauron. After centuries of hiding in the far east, he had returned to western Middle-earth, drawn by the proximity to Mordor and by the strategic location of Mirkwood. He could not yet take a full physical form. could not appear as he had in the Second Age, for he did not have the ring, but he could gather armies again, could breed orcs and wargs, could send his Nazgûl forth to do his bidding, though they too were diminished without the full power of the 9 rings focused through the one. For nearly 2,000 years Sauron dwelt in Dol Guldur, slowly rebuilding his strength, searching always for the ring, sending his servants to scour the lands for any rumor or hint of its location. The Gladden Fields were searched many times, but the river had changed course over the centuries and the ring remained hidden. Then, in the year 2463, came a discovery that would change everything. A creature named Déagol was fishing in the Gladden Fields with his friend Sméagol. Déagol's hook caught on something heavy on the riverbed, and when he dove down to investigate, he found a golden ring, beautiful and perfectly preserved despite its centuries in the water. The moment he touched it, the ring's power awoke, and Sméagol saw the ring and wanted it with a desire that overwhelmed all friendship, all decency, all humanity. The two friends struggled there in the mud of the riverbank, and Sméagol strangled Déagol, murdering his friend to possess the ring. It was the ring's first murder in the Third Age, but it would not be the last. Sméagol took the ring and hid it, fleeing from his people when they discovered his crime. He went into the mountains, finding dark tunnels where he could hide from the sun, which hurt his eyes, for the ring was changing him, twisting him, making him into something other than what he had been. Over the years, Sméagol transformed completely. He became Gollum, named for the horrible sound he made in his throat, a creature of shadow and obsession, loving and hating the ring in equal measure, calling it his precious, his birthday present, the only thing in the world that mattered to him. Sauron sensed the ring's awakening, felt its power stir after millennia of dormancy. He did not know who had found it, or exactly where it was, but he knew it was in the world again, active again, and he redoubled his efforts to locate it. The Nazgûl were sent forth to search, to question, to torture anyone who might have knowledge. But Gollum was cunning in his madness. He hid deep in the misty mountains, in tunnels that went down and down into the darkness, places where even orcs feared to go. There he lived, catching fish in underground lakes, hunting orcs when he could, surviving on whatever he could find, always clutching his precious ring, speaking to it in the darkness, arguing with it, loving it and hating it. The world above changed around him, and he barely noticed. Wars were fought, kingdoms rose and fell, the shadow continued to grow, and Gollum remained in his tunnels, ageless and wretched, preserved by the ring, but corrupted utterly by its power. Meanwhile, in the year 2850, Gandalf the Grey finally penetrated the secrets of Dol Guldur. Gandalf was one of the Istari, the wizards who had been sent to Middle-earth by the Valar around the year 1000 to help the free peoples resist Sauron's return. He had long suspected that the necromancer was more than he appeared, and finally he confirmed it. The necromancer was Sauron himself, returned and rebuilding his power. This discovery led to the formation of the White Council, a gathering of the wise and powerful from among the elves and wizards. Galadriel and Elrond were part of it, as was Saruman the White, the head of the Istarian keeper of much ancient lore. They met in secret and debated what should be done about the growing shadow. Gandalf urged them to attack Dol Guldur immediately, to drive Sauron out before he could become too strong. But Saruman counseled patience. He argued that they should wait, watch, gather more information. What Saruman did not reveal was that he had his own plans, his own ambitions. He had begun to study the lore of the rings, to desire the One Ring for himself, believing he could use it for good, where others had failed. So the White Council waited, and Sauron's power continued to grow. In the year 2941, however, events finally forced their hand. Sauron's influence had grown so strong that it could no longer be ignored, and the council finally agreed to assault Dol Guldur. But Sauron had been expecting this. He had already laid plans to return to Mordor, to his true fortress of Barad-dûr. When the White Council attacked, he fled, abandoning Dol Guldur and going east to Mordor, openly declaring himself at last. The Third Age was nearing its end, and the final confrontation was approaching. Yet even as these great events unfolded, the ring itself was about to change hands again. In that same year, 2941, a hobbit named Bilbo Baggins, on an adventure with a company of dwarves, became lost in the dark tunnels under the misty mountains. And there, in the deepest darkness, he found something lying on the ground, something that Gollum had dropped in his endless wanderings, a golden ring. Bilbo picked it up and put it in his pocket, thinking it a lucky find. He did not know what it was, did not understand that he now carried the most dangerous object in all of Middle-earth. And Gollum, discovering his loss, screamed in rage and grief in the darkness, crying out for his precious, his birthday present stolen from him by the nasty hobbitses. Thus the ring came into the hands of the hobbits, the smallest and most unlikely of all the peoples of Middle-earth. And Sauron, returned to Mordor, began the final gathering of his forces, preparing for the war that would end the Third Age and decide the fate of all Middle-earth. He rebuilt Barad-dûr, though it took many years, for without the ring his power was limited. He could not make it as mighty as it had been, but it was still a formidable fortress, a place of darkness and evil. He gathered armies again, breeding orcs by the thousands, making alliances with the men of the east and the south who had never loved the descendants of Númenor. And always, always he searched for the ring. His Nazgûl rode forth on their fell beasts, questioning, threatening, hunting. His spies went into every corner of Middle-earth, for Sauron knew that without the ring he could never achieve complete dominion. With it, he would be invincible, would rule all things forever. The ring had to be found, and slowly, through torture and interrogation, through the corruption of Gollum himself, who was captured by his servants and questioned in the dungeons of Barad-dûr, Sauron learned a clue. Shira Baggins. These words meant nothing to him at first, but his servants were sent forth to discover their meaning, to find this Shire and this Baggins who might possess the ring. The hunt was on, and time was running out. The final act of the long drama that had begun in the First Age, with Mairon's first attraction to Melkor's power, was about to unfold. The ring had come nearly full circle, from Mount Doom where it was forged to the Shire where it lay hidden, and now it would return to its place of making one way or another. Either it would return to Sauron's hand, and he would achieve dominion over all living things, making real at last his ancient dream of perfect order through absolute control, or it would return to the fires of Orodruin to be destroyed, and Sauron with it, ending forever the threat he posed. The War of the Ring was coming, and the world held its breath, waiting to see which way the balance would fall. The year 3018 of the Third Age marked the beginning of the end. Gandalf had discovered the truth about Bilbo's ring, had tested it in fire, and seen the inscription appear, the words in the black speech that proved beyond doubt that this was the One Ring, the master of all the rings of power. And with that discovery came the terrible knowledge that Sauron would stop at nothing to reclaim it. The ring had to be destroyed, thrown into the fires of Mount Doom where it had been forged, for only those fires were hot enough to unmake it. But Mordor was surrounded by enemies, and Sauron's power had grown immense. How could anyone hope to reach Mount Doom and destroy the ring? The answer came from an unexpected source. Frodo Baggins, Bilbo's heir, a simple hobbit from the Shire who knew nothing of great wars or ancient powers, volunteered to take the ring to Mordor. It seemed like madness, but Gandalf saw in it a strange wisdom. Sauron would be looking for mighty warriors, for princes and wizards who might try to use the ring against him. He would never imagine that the ring-bearer would be a hobbit, or that the goal would be destruction rather than domination. So the Fellowship of the Ring was formed, 9 companions to stand against the 9 Nazgûl. There was Frodo the Ring-bearer and his companion Sam Gamgee, who refused to leave his master's side. Merry and Pippin, 2 other hobbits, came along as well, loyal friends who would not be left behind. Gandalf the wizard would guide them. Aragorn, the heir of Isildur, though his line had wandered in the wilderness for centuries, would protect them. Legolas the elf and Gimli the dwarf represented their peoples, and Boromir of Gondor stood for the realm of men. They set out in secret from Rivendell, bearing the ring south toward Mordor. But Sauron was not idle. He had learned of the Shire, had sent his Nazgûl to find it, and though they had failed to capture the ring, they had alerted their master that it was moving. The hunt was on. From the high chamber of Barad-dûr, Sauron reached out with his will, searching, always searching. He could not see the ring directly, for its bearer did not wear it, but he could feel it, sense its presence in the world like a distant star in a clouded sky. And he bent all his efforts toward finding it and reclaiming what was his. The Eye of Sauron, as it came to be called, was not a literal eye, but the focused will of the Dark Lord, reaching out across Middle-earth, searching for the ring. Those who fell under his gaze felt it like a weight upon their souls, a terrible presence that could crush the spirit and break the will. The Fellowship's journey was fraught with peril from the start. They were attacked by orcs in the mines of Moria, and there Gandalf fell, dragged into darkness by a Balrog, an ancient demon of fire and shadow. The Fellowship emerged from Moria grieving, their guide lost, their hope diminished. But Sauron's attention was not only on finding the ring. He had been preparing for war for many years, and now he launched his assault on the free peoples of Middle-earth. If he could not yet reclaim the ring, he would at least crush all opposition, making himself master of the world even without his greatest weapon. His first target was Gondor, the great kingdom of men that had opposed him for so long. He sent vast armies against it, led by the Witch King of Angmar, the Lord of the Nazgul. The armies marched from Minas Morgul, the tower that had once been Minas Ithil, the Tower of the Moon, but which had been captured and corrupted centuries before. At the same time, Saruman, who had been secretly corrupted by his study of the ring lore and his communications with Sauron through a palantir, launched his own assault on Rohan, the kingdom of horse lords allied with Gondor. Saruman believed he could seize power for himself in the confusion, could claim the ring when it was found and use it to supplant Sauron. But Sauron had been using Saruman all along, feeding him lies and half-truths, encouraging his ambition while planning to discard him once he was no longer useful. The White Wizard had become a pawn in a game he thought he was playing as a master. The Fellowship broke at Amon Hen. Boromir, driven mad by the ring's temptation, tried to take it from Frodo by force, though he failed and repented before his death, defending Merry and Pippin from orcs. His attempt showed how even the best of men could be corrupted by the ring's power. Frodo and Sam went on alone toward Mordor, while the others pursued the orcs who had captured Merry and Pippin. Meanwhile, the war unfolded across Middle-earth. Saruman's forces attacked Rohan, but were defeated at Helm's Deep, where the arrival of Gandalf, returned from death with greater power, turned the tide. The Ents, the ancient shepherds of trees, awakened and destroyed Isengard, Saruman's fortress, ending his threat forever. But the greater war was yet to come. Sauron's main army marched on Minas Tirith, the great city of Gondor. The siege of the city was terrible, with the Witch King himself breaking the gates and entering the city, spreading despair wherever he went. It seemed that all would be lost, that Gondor would fall, and with it all hope of resisting Sauron. Yet in the darkest hour relief came. The Rohirrim, the horse lords of Rohan, arrived with an army of 6,000 riders, having ridden in secret to Gondor's aid. They charged into the besieging army, and in the battle of the Pelennor fields the tide began to turn. Eowyn, niece of Theoden, the king of Rohan, faced the Witch King himself. He who had terrorized Middle-earth for centuries, who had broken kingdoms and slain countless heroes, boasted that no living man could kill him. But Eowyn was no man, and with the help of Merry the Hobbit, she struck down the Lord of the Nazgul, destroying him utterly. It was a great victory, but it was not enough. Sauron's forces were too numerous, and even with the Witch King fallen, the war was far from won. The armies of Gondor and Rohan had been greatly reduced, and Sauron had more forces in reserve, armies that could overwhelm them utterly if given time to deploy. Aragorn, revealed now as the true king returned, made a desperate decision. He would lead the remaining army to the Black Gate of Mordor itself, challenging Sauron directly, drawing his attention away from his own lands. It was a suicide mission, a doomed last stand, but it had a purpose: to give Frodo and Sam time to reach Mount Doom. For Frodo and Sam had indeed entered Mordor, guided by Gollum, who had followed them from the moment they left Rivendell. Gollum was a twisted, treacherous creature, but he knew the secret ways into Mordor, and he led them through Tirith Ungol, the Pass of the Spider. But Gollum's plan was betrayal. He led them into the lair of Shelob, a giant spider descended from the same brood as Ungoliant who had helped Melkor destroy the two trees. Shelob attacked Frodo, stinging him with her venom, and it seemed the quest had failed. Yet Sam, faithful Sam, drove off the spider with the light of Erendil's star, captured in a phial by Galadriel. He took the ring, meaning to complete the quest himself if Frodo had died. But Frodo was only paralyzed, not slain, and Sam rescued him from the orcs who had captured his body. Together, the two hobbits continued across Mordor, across the plain of Gorgoroth toward Mount Doom. They traveled in terrible hardship, with no food or water save what they had brought, through a land that seemed designed to crush all hope and life. The ring grew heavier with each step, and Frodo began to fail under its weight and its constant temptation. At the Black Gate, Aragorn and the captains of the West made their stand. 7,000 men faced an army of perhaps 100,000 orcs and other foul creatures. The mouth of Sauron, the lieutenant of Barad-dûr, came forth to parley, offering terms of surrender and displaying items that suggested the ring-bearer had been captured. But Gandalf rejected the terms and the battle began. It was hopeless from the start. The army of the West was surrounded and outnumbered more than 10-1. They fought with desperate courage, knowing they would all die, but buying time with their lives every moment they held, giving Frodo one more chance to reach the mountain. In Barad-dûr, Sauron watched through his palantir, and he was pleased. He had won. The armies of men were about to be destroyed, and soon all Middle-earth would bow before him. He had not yet found the ring, but it was only a matter of time. His servants would scour every corner of the world until it was recovered. But even as these thoughts filled his mind, something happened that he had not anticipated, could never have anticipated. His attention was suddenly drawn to Mount Doom itself, to the Samath Nar, the chambers of fire where the ring had been forged. Someone was there, in the heart of his domain, at the very place where the ring could be destroyed. Frodo had reached the crack of doom, the volcanic fissure where the ring had been made. He stood on the edge, holding the ring in his hand, ready at last to throw it into the fire and end Sauron's power forever. All he had to do was let it go, release it, and everything would be over. But he could not do it. After carrying the ring all that way, enduring all that suffering, being worn down by its constant weight and temptation, Frodo's will finally broke. At the last moment, standing at the precipice of victory, he claimed the ring for himself. "The ring is mine," he declared, and he put it on his finger. In that instant, Sauron knew everything. He knew where the ring was, knew that it was about to be destroyed, knew that all his plans, all his works of thousands of years hung by a thread. The eye turned from the battle at the Black Gate, focused utterly on Mount Doom. He commanded the Nazgul to fly to Orodruin with all speed, to kill the ring-bearer and recover the ring before it could be destroyed. But Sauron had not counted on Gollum. The wretched creature had followed Frodo and Sam even into Mount Doom, obsessed with reclaiming his precious. When Frodo put on the ring, Gollum attacked him, fighting for the ring with mad desperation. They struggled on the edge of the crack of doom, and Gollum bit off Frodo's finger, ring and all. For one moment, Gollum held the ring again. His precious returned to him at last, and he danced in mad joy on the edge of the precipice. Then he slipped, or perhaps the ring itself betrayed him one final time. Gollum fell into the fires of Mount Doom, still clutching the ring. And in that moment, the ring was unmade. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. Sauron had put so much of his power into the ring that when it was destroyed, he was destroyed with it. His body, such as it was, dissolved into nothing. His spirit, which had survived the fall of Númenor and the defeat at the end of the Second Age, was dispersed, scattered into the void, reduced to a powerless shadow that could never again take form or influence the world. Barad-dûr, built with the ring's power, could not stand without it. The great tower collapsed, crumbling into ruin, and with it fell all the gates and walls and fortifications of Mordor. The ground shook, and Mount Doom erupted in fury, as though the land itself was tearing apart. The Nazgûl, flying toward Mount Doom on their fell beasts, were caught in the eruption and destroyed, their forms consumed by fire, their spirits released at last from the bondage that had held them for millennia. At the Black Gate, the orcs and other servants of Sauron suddenly felt their master's will disappear. Without that will to drive them, they broke and fled in terror, or turned on each other in confusion. The battle was over. Against all hope, against all odds, the West had won. Frodo and Sam, caught on the slopes of the erupting mountain, were rescued by the eagles, the great birds who served Manwë and who had long been friends to the free peoples. They were borne to safety and healing, their quest complete, their burden lifted at last. The War of the Ring was ended. Sauron was destroyed, not defeated as he had been before, but utterly annihilated, reduced to less than a shadow, unable to ever threaten Middle-earth again. The Third Age was drawing to a close, and with it, the long shadow that had lain across the world since the First Age, since Mairon first listened to Melkor's lies and began the long descent into darkness. The victory had been won by the smallest and most unlikely of heroes, by hobbits who knew nothing of the great powers and ancient wars, who simply endured and did what needed to be done because it was right. And in the end, it was not strength or wisdom that destroyed the ring, but mercy and pity. For if Bilbo had not spared Gollum, and if Frodo had not shown him mercy as well, the creature would not have been there at the last to fall into the fire with the ring. From the ashes of Sauron's defeat, a new age would rise. But the story of the Dark Lord was finished, his long fall from light to darkness complete, his ambitions turned to dust, his power broken beyond all recovery. The one who had been Mairon the Admirable, who had become Sauron the Abhorred, who had dreamed of ordering the world in perfection through domination, was no more. and Middle-earth, scarred but free, could begin the long work of healing. The destruction of the ring and the fall of Sauron marked the end of an era that had lasted for thousands of years. The shadow that had hung over Middle-earth since the First Age was finally lifted, and the world could breathe freely again. But the victory came at tremendous cost, and the scars of Sauron's evil would remain visible for generations to come. Aragorn was crowned king of the reunited kingdom of Arnor and Gondor, taking the name Elisar, meaning Elfstone. He married Arwen, daughter of Elrond, uniting the lines of elves and men. Under his rule, the kingdom flourished, and peace returned to the lands that had known war for so long. The line of Isildur had redeemed itself at last. For where Isildur had failed to destroy the ring, his heir had led the forces that made its destruction possible. But even in victory, there was sadness. The elves, who had fought against Sauron through all the long ages, were leaving Middle-earth. The three rings, which had preserved their realms and given them strength, lost their power when the one was destroyed, for all the rings were bound together. Without the three, the elven realms began to fade, and the elves themselves felt the call of Valinor more strongly than ever. Galadriel, Elrond, and Gandalf, the bearers of the three rings, departed across the sea to the Undying Lands, taking with them much of the wisdom and beauty that had graced Middle-earth. The great elven kingdoms dwindled, and eventually all of the Elder would follow, leaving the world to men, as had been foreseen from the beginning. Even Frodo, though he had survived the quest, found that he could not truly heal from the wounds he had received, both physical and spiritual. The burden of the ring had marked him too deeply, and after a few years in the Shire, he too sailed west, one of the few mortals ever granted that grace to find peace in the undying lands beyond the circles of the world. The Age of Men had begun. An age without the guidance of elves or wizards, without the visible presence of the Valar or their servants. It would be an age of freedom and choice, where men would have to find their own way for good or ill, without the intercession of higher powers. But what of Sauron's legacy? What did his long existence, his corruption, his wars, and his final defeat mean for the world he left behind? To understand this, we must look not just at what he did, but at what he represented, and what can be learned from his fall. Sauron had begun as Mairon, a being of genuine skill and knowledge who loved order and beauty. His corruption began with a simple idea: that order could be imposed from above, that chaos and inefficiency could be eliminated through control, that a sufficiently wise and powerful being could organize the world perfectly, if only given the authority to do so. This idea is itself not evil. The desire for order, for beauty, for things to work properly and efficiently, these are good desires. But Sauron's mistake, the mistake that led to his fall, was in believing that order through domination was preferable to the messier reality of freedom. He looked at the world and saw waste and suffering, and he believed these could be eliminated if only everyone would submit to his will. He did not see that freedom itself has value, that the ability to choose, even to choose wrongly, is essential to the dignity of conscious beings. He wanted to make everything perfect, but his perfection would have been the perfection of a machine, not the imperfect beauty of living things. Melkor had corrupted him by feeding these ideas, by reinforcing his pride and his belief in his own superiority. And once Sauron had accepted the premise that he knew better than others what was good for them, the rest followed inevitably. If he knew what was best, then those who resisted were simply ignorant or perverse. If his vision was perfect, then any means of achieving it were justified. This is the great danger that Sauron represents, the corruption of good intentions into tyranny. He never saw himself as evil. Even at his worst, he believed, or told himself he believed, that he was working toward a worthy goal, that the suffering he caused was regrettable but necessary. That order was worth any price. The ring itself was the ultimate expression of this philosophy. It was a tool of perfect domination, allowing its wielder to impose their will absolutely on others. And because Sauron had poured so much of himself into it, it carried his corruption with it, turning everyone who tried to use it into a reflection of Sauron himself, no matter how good their intentions might have been. Gandalf refused to touch it, knowing it would corrupt him. Galadriel was tempted by it, seeing in her mind a vision of herself as a beautiful and terrible queen, wielding absolute power for what she believed to be good ends, and she had the wisdom and strength to reject that vision. Even Boromir, a good man and a true warrior, was driven to madness by its temptation, by the promise that he could use it to save his people. The ring showed that power itself, absolute power, is inherently corrupting, that no one can wield it without being changed by it, twisted into something other than what they were. This was Sauron's final legacy, proof that domination, however benevolent it might claim to be, is always tyranny in the end. And yet Sauron was defeated not by greater power, but by its opposite. Frodo had no armies, no magical weapons, no great strength or knowledge. He was simply a small person trying to do what was right, enduring suffering and hardship because the task needed doing. Sam was even simpler. A gardener who refused to abandon his friend, who carried him when he could walk no further, who remained faithful when all hope seemed lost. The great powers, the armies and the wizards and the ancient kings served their purpose. They fought the battles that needed fighting, held back the darkness long enough for the ring to be destroyed. But in the end, it was the small and humble who achieved victory, who succeeded where the mighty would have failed. This, too, is part of Sauron's legacy, though not one he would have chosen. His defeat proved that might does not make right, that the great and powerful are not always wise, that sometimes the fate of the world rests in the hands of those who seem least significant. Sauron despised weakness, valued only strength and power and domination. He could never have imagined that hobbits, creatures he would have dismissed as beneath notice, would be the instruments of his downfall. His very blindness to them, his inability to conceive that the ring might be carried toward destruction rather than toward power, was part of what made their quest possible. And there is mercy in Sauron's end. though it might not seem so at first. He was not imprisoned like Melkor, left to rage impotently in the void until the end of all things. Instead, he was dispersed, his consciousness scattered, his very being unmade. For one who had been Mairon, who had known beauty and craft and the joy of creation, perhaps this was a kind of release, an end to the torment of being Sauron, of being trapped in evil and unable to escape it. Could Sauron have been redeemed? The question haunted the wise for ages afterward. He had been offered the chance after Melkor's fall to return to Valinor and face judgment. If he had accepted, if he had humbled himself and truly repented, could he have been restored? Perhaps. The Valar were merciful, and even the greatest sins could be forgiven for those who truly turned from them. But Sauron's pride prevented him from taking that step. And once he had refused it, each subsequent choice made redemption more difficult, until finally he had gone so far down the dark path that there was no returning. He had bound himself to the ring, making it the container of his power and his will. In doing so, he had also made it the container of his fate. When the ring was destroyed, there was nothing left of Sauron to redeem or punish. Only a dissipating shadow, a consciousness fading into nothing. The rings of power themselves became objects of legend and warning. The 9 and the 7 were destroyed or lost. Their evil ended with their master. The 3 faded when the 1 was unmade, becoming mere trinkets without power. And the One Ring itself was gone, melted back into the primal fire from which it had been forged, taking with it the last great concentration of evil power in Middle-earth. Future generations would tell stories of Sauron, of the Dark Lord who had threatened to engulf the world in shadow. Parents would warn their children about the dangers of pride and the lust for power. Scholars would study the accounts of his rise and fall, seeking to understand how one so bright could fall so far. But the living memory of him faded with time, as all memories do. The scars he left on the land healed slowly. Mordor remained a wasteland for ages. But eventually, even the volcanic plains of Gorgoroth began to support life again. Minas Morgul was cleansed and renamed, though it was never again inhabited, standing as a monument to the evil that had dwelt there. The world moved on, as worlds do. New kingdoms rose, new heroes emerged, new stories were told. The age of men unfolded with all its triumphs and tragedies, its beauties and its sorrows. And through it all, the memory of Sauron served as a reminder of what could happen when the desire for order became the lust for domination, when love of beauty twisted into pride and cruelty. In the end, Sauron's legacy was not the dark empire he had sought to build, but the light that had opposed and defeated him, the courage of those who resisted, the faithfulness of friends who would not abandon each other, the wisdom of those who knew when to refuse power rather than seize it. These were what endured when his darkness was gone. And perhaps, in some small way, even Sauron's fall served a purpose. For in showing how far one could fall, in demonstrating the ultimate futility of seeking to dominate all living things, he taught a lesson that echoed through the ages. The true order comes not from control, but from freedom. The true beauty lies not in perfection, but in the imperfect glory of living things, and that the smallest person can change the course of the future, while the mightiest can be brought low by their own pride. The third age ended and the fourth began, and the world turned and life continued. Sauron was gone, truly and finally gone, and would never return. The long shadow was lifted, and under the sky of Middle-earth free peoples could build their futures without fear of his malice. It was not a perfect world that remained. There was still sorrow and loss, still choices between right and wrong, still the constant struggle between light and darkness in every heart. But it was a world free from the domination of one will seeking to enslave all others, and in that freedom lay hope. And so ends the tale of Sauron, the abhorred, who was once Mairon the Admirable, whose story is a warning and a lesson, whose defeat is a testament to courage and hope, and whose final dispersal into nothingness was perhaps the only mercy left to one who had refused all others. And that, my dear friends, is where we must end our journey tonight. We have traveled far together, from the timeless halls before the world began, through all the long ages of Middle-earth, watching as one bright spirit fell into shadow and became the greatest threat the world would know, until finally being unmade by the courage of the smallest and most unlikely heroes. It has been a long tale, I know, full of darkness and sorrow, of pride and corruption, of wars that spanned millennia and changed the very shape of the world. But I hope you have also seen in it the light that never failed, the courage that endured through all hardship, the love and friendship that proved stronger than any power of domination. Sauron's story is ultimately a tragedy, the tale of someone who had everything, who was admirable and skilled and beautiful, and who threw it all away in pursuit of control and perfection. He believed he could order the world better than its creator, believed he knew what was best for all living things, and that belief led him down a path from which there was no return. But his defeat shows us that evil, no matter how powerful, cannot ultimately triumph. Not because good is stronger in any simple sense, but because freedom and love and mercy contain a power that domination can never match. The ring was destroyed not by force, but by the consequences of mercy shown to Gollum, by the faithfulness of Sam to Frodo, by the courage of those who resisted the temptation to use power even when it might have seemed to serve good ends. As you drift off to sleep tonight, I hope you will remember this, that the smallest acts of kindness and courage matter, that the choices we make between controlling others and respecting their freedom shape the world more than any amount of power, and that darkness, however deep, is always temporary, while the light endures. Sleep well, dear friends. Dream of the world as it was meant to be, where the stars shine bright and the shadows have fled, where friends journey together and courage never fails, and where even the darkest night must give way eventually to the dawn. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the ages of Middle-earth, through the rise and fall of Sauron. If you enjoyed this tale, please let me know, and perhaps we shall take another such journey together soon, exploring other corners of Tolkien's vast and beautiful mythology. But for now, rest. The tale is told. The darkness is defeated and all is well. Until next time, stay safe and sweet dreams